I was told that I could speak about anything, but it would help if I was really passionate about it. So I've been thinking about thinking, and specifically, how do everyday physical environments change how we think? Do they change how we think, in fact? Some time ago, a couple of years ago, a British supermarket chain gave its top managers some signs to put on their office doors saying, "Please do not disturb, I'm thinking." I mean, it's kind of interesting that they thought it wasn't worthwhile giving the signs to anybody else, but that's probably another story. I think this would be almost impossible to happen today for a number of reasons. Firstly, we've become rather obsessed of late with open plan offices, so we don't have our own offices half the time, and there are no doors to hang the sign on, so it'd probably be a bit of a waste of time. Secondly, an increasing number of companies, and this actually worries me, this is very much a sort of US trend. The supermarket I'm talking about now, the offices have actually vanished, and where the desks are, they operate a thing, I don't know if you've come across this, called a clean desk policy. And this essentially means that anything that's left on the desk after 6 o'clock at night gets thrown in the bin. I'm not talking about photographs or computers or phones, although you might argue that would be a really good thing. I'm talking about scribbled bits of paper, memos, post-it notes, thinking, basically. So this worries me a little bit. And I guess the idea behind this is that, I don't know, a sort of messy desk is a messy mind or something. But there was a great quote from Einstein, which I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was very much along the lines of, if a cluttered desk is the sign of a cluttered mind, what then is an empty desk the sign of? And I'm sort of rather fond of that. The third reason I think it would be impossible to have these signs today is that it's almost impossible nowadays, particularly at work and other places, not to be disturbed. We no longer have secretaries, or most people don't have secretaries, so phone calls come straight through. We also have our own mobiles, we have email, we have Twitter, we have a bunch of other stuff. And there's a sort of cacophony of particularly mobile devices that don't really respect time or place. They just go off when they feel like it, basically, not necessarily when it's convenient for us. I mean, it is obviously possible to turn all this stuff off, but very, very few of us actually seem to do that. Does this actually matter? You would immediately ask. Well, I think it does matter. I think it matters rather a lot. I mean, putting aside to how such continual interruptions I think are affecting human relationships, there is the very sort of key thing, I think, that they are in danger of destroying serious thinking, serious conversation, which is very much the sort of the subject I'd like to talk about. Now, this is kind of odd. I don't know if you have the phrase out-of-the-box thinking in Poland. It's one of the worst pieces of corporate jargon ever invented. It's up there with blue sky thinking, but I'm kind of assuming this is what they mean by an out-of-the-box thinker over here. He's kind of wandering off. Obviously had enough of sitting in a grey cubicle all day. Companies are obsessed with creativity, innovation, this so-called outside-of-the-box thinking. But I think it's precisely this type of thinking that's being threatened by this sort of constant disruption and noise and so on. I mean, the kind of thinking I'm interested in, the kind of thinking that I think most of us are interested in, most corporations, most governments, just about everybody is interested in, really, is kind of focused, deliberate, calm, sustained, concentrated, and probably above all else, reflective thinking. And I think you can do that almost anywhere, but certain environments suit that type of thinking much, much more than others. A few years ago, I was doing some research for a book, and I was getting into this idea of where people have their best thoughts, and I asked pretty much 1,000 people where and when they did their best thinking. Now, I should stress, I didn't need to explain to them what that meant. I think they instinctively felt that they knew what that meant, and I think most people would say, well, that's to do with sort of highest quality, most serious, most useful, most productive, best ideas, and so on and so forth. So I asked 1,000 people. They ranged in age from about 8 to about 80, male, female, different countries around the world, different professions. Out of 1,000 people, only one person said they did their best thinking in the office. And they were lying. Because they said really, really early in the morning when there's nobody else in the office, which isn't really an office as far as I can see. Now, if you actually sort of crunch the numbers on this, it was quite interesting what people actually said. And some of this is actually no surprise at all. The top 10 responses were, when I'm alone was number one. That's where people felt they did their best thinking. Second one was last thing at night or in bed. I did actually sort of group some of this together. In the shower is true. It was in number third position. It's funny enough, there was actually a hotel chain in America. They developed some waterproof whiteboards and waterproof markers, so if you had an idea in the shower in their hotel, you could write it down. Don't think it worked, but anyway. I'm not sure if somebody had that idea in the shower, but anyway. First thing in the morning, I'm not talking sort of 8 o'clock, I'm talking, early, really quite early. In the car, driving was surprisingly popular. I didn't think that would come up, and I think there's a reason for that, which we could possibly delve into. Reading books, in particular, newspapers, magazines. Now, this was a couple of years ago, so definitely no iPads, Kindles, early adoption only. Be interesting to see if that would change or not. In the bath is on the list. That's in number 7, no, 7th place. Outside was quite a popular response, and if you sort of ask people, where outside, beside water came up an awful lot. Sea was very popular. Any water that moves, rivers, very popular, although lakes came up as well. But moving water, particularly the sea, was very popular. Anywhere came in at number 9, and jogging, running around was in number 10. And I think it was not running between meetings. It was more, proper going for a run. Now, let me read out a few of the individual responses. I do my best thinking loading the dishwasher, scrubbing the floors, scouring the pans, doing the polishing and the cleaning. I'm not going to tell you who said that, but he's a billionaire. Over the decades, I think that my best thinking has occurred when I'm visiting a foreign country, have my obligations out of the way, and I'm sitting in a pleasant spot in a cafe near a lake with a piece of paper in front of me. That's a Harvard professor saying that one. I do my best thinking in bed, sometimes even when asleep. I wake up having solved a problem. Film director. Usually I do my best thinking when I'm not working, and most often when I'm traveling. That was a brain surgeon. I sit down, usually at home, in my study, in my grandmother's Welsh oak chair, there's a connection, with a sharp pencil and a blank notebook, and start to draw out the idea almost graphically. This is my favourite one. My best thinking occurs at 37,000 feet, halfway into my second gin and tonic, in a very hot bath. I do my best thinking if I go to church, away from things where I'm forced to stop working and usually drift off and stop listening. Couple more. I do my best thinking on the morning run. The crisper the air, the better. I like big sky, open fields, and lots of fresh air. And the last one, not sitting in front of a screen. I tend to find that ideas come to me when I'm sitting on the ferry, in the shower, walking between meetings, listening to the radio. I think it is something to do with having mild diversions between you and the problem. Now, do any of these responses have anything in common? Well, that's a little bit subjective, but I would suggest that yes, a significant proportion of these share a couple of factors. They both involve a relative degree of solitude and silence. And I think this is very, very interesting. I mean, in an age of sort of multitasking and sort of constant disruption and 24 mobile access to absolutely anything we could possibly want, hanging around doing nothing, or what appears superficially to be nothing, appears to be vastly underrated. Now, I think this is connected to how our minds work. This was a picture I took a month ago in London, and these are not homeless people. These are people that just need some more sleep. And they were just having their lunchtime nap. The siesta, it seems, is coming back. Our minds need to switch off. They can't be working the whole time. They just need to rest. But it's also where memories are consolidated. It's where things are connected together. It's kind of where ideas come from, if you like. It's a bit like, we need ideas to jump into bed together with each other and get a little bit frisky. That's where ideas come from to a very large extent. Where else do good ideas come from? I think going for a very long walk helps. I mean, the expression clear your head, I think actually comes from somewhere, to be honest. I think wandering around places for no reason, wandering around new cities, bookshops and so on and so forth. Another thing that works very well, that came up a lot, is doing something that's very mundane or very repetitive, and ideally something that's quite physical that uses our hands. And I think this is to do with using a different part of our brain than is subconsciously working on the problem. I think travel could be pretty useful too. And I think that's for a number of reasons. I think long-haul flights are especially productive, particularly if you've got a window to look out of. I mean, first of all, I think it's because you're suspended between places. There's not much you can actually do. So in a sense, you are forced to actually relax. You don't have access to a lot of the stuff we have access to in our daily lives. So I think that's extremely important. And I think the view out of the window is extremely important as well. I actually flew here on Ryanair yesterday, which didn't look like this at all. And I have to say, though, it didn't work on Ryanair. But I have, on other occasions, with a reasonable view and a little bit further up the plane, it's worked quite well. I think the key here, though, is it's to do with the diversity of experiences, and it's to do with cross-fertilization. So the more diverse inputs you can get, the more interesting outputs you'll get. So just staying in one spot and taking the same route to work and staying at the same desk all day is probably almost the worst thing you can do. Get out there and go and do some new stuff. I think scale is quite important, and I think this is quite often overlooked. I think you sometimes need to feel physically small to have a very big idea. I mean, this is, I think, why people mention mountains. I think it's why looking out of aeroplane windows work very well. I think space travel, if you can try it, would be fantastic. I mean, it's been mentioned quite a lot. I mean, there's a guy called Ed Mitchell, who you probably won't know because he was the 6th man to walk on the moon, not the first. And he said, when you see yourself in this bigger perspective, a shift takes place in your perception and you think quite differently. And I think that can happen up mountains. I think that can looking out of airplane windows and so on and so forth. I think artists, funnily enough, instinctively get this. It's all about light and space, to some extent view and distance. And I think, if you're trying to create a masterpiece, a basement with very low ceilings and strip fluorescent lighting is probably not the best idea you could possibly have. And let's not forget about churches. I mentioned churches to a teacher a while ago, and I said, I find personally churches are kind of interesting. You walk into a really good church, or particularly a really big cathedral, and it changes how you think. And he said, no, I think you're wrong, actually. What happens to me is it changes how I feel, and that in turn, my mood then changes how I think, which is quite an interesting thought, and it's probably worth looking at it a bit more. Personally, I think with churches, it's to do with history, it's to do with extremely high ceilings, it's to do with light, and it's to do with sound. And it's either close to silence or it's music, which I haven't really got time to get into, but I think music fundamentally affects how we think. And certain types of music can have certain types of thinking coming out. Another quite interesting thinking space is the public library, or libraries in general. And libraries, I don't know about here, but libraries in the UK are having an extremely bad time at the moment because the local councils and governments that fund them are trying to save money. And there is also the view that they're increasingly irrelevant. What on earth do we need them for? I mean, in the age of Google and e-books, what could you possibly want a public library for? Let's get rid of them, let's close them down. I mean, nobody pretty much between about the ages of 6 and 66 will be found in a library very often. But I think this rather misses the point. Physical books are definitely part of the story, or books in one form or another, and that's a big debate. And so are a few other things you'll find in libraries. But I think libraries are important in terms of thinking, not because of what's in them, but because of what's not in them. We're living in a world that's becoming much faster, much noisier, it's full of more interruptions, and libraries, I think, are one of the very, very few spaces we have left where you can literally hear yourself think. And for that reason, I think they need protecting. Most libraries, unfortunately, don't seem to get this. I think they are caught up with a sort of modernization drive, which involves allowing people to use mobile phones either throughout the whole thing or in parts of it. Laptops, which there's no problem with a laptop, but I can tell you from experience, if you go into a library and there's 300 people tapping on a laptop, that actually can get kind of noisy. In my view, libraries should stop trying to compete with Starbucks. If you allow the use of mobile phones, if you put coffee in and you allow laptops, you don't, in my view, have a library. You've got a Starbucks. I think libraries should do the absolute opposite. So here's my idea. We should fight to preserve silent spaces. I think they are extremely important, and effectively we should make an awful lot of noise about keeping certain places silent. I'm not talking about all places. I'm talking about some very specific spaces. I think we should start, and some people are clearly doing it, to restrict the use of mobile phones in certain environments. Very few. I'm not talking about very many environments, just a few. We are beginning to see the emergence of quiet coaches on trains and quiet areas in planes. I think that's a good idea. And I think if you make a lot of noise, you should get thrown off. I mean, obviously not literally if it's a plane, but maybe you get fined or something. I don't know. But I think that stuff is probably impractical and far too obvious. I was watching a documentary about Leonard Cohen a little while ago, and Bono, Adam Clayton, Larry Mullen, and The Edge from U2 were commenting on it. And they were asked about Cohen's music. And I think it was Bono made a really great comment that Leonard's success as a singer-songwriter, and particularly as a songwriter, came from the fact that he was patient. Very, very patient. I mean, if he couldn't find what he was looking for, he'd just wait until he got the words that he wanted. But there was one member of U2 that made another comment that really caught my imagination. And he said that if you study the early stages of Christianity, there was the widespread belief that if you wanted to hear God's voice, you had to go somewhere really, really quiet. I mean, I'm not particularly religious, but there is a certain logic, you must admit to that. So here's my idea. I think we should invent think weeks. I think the EU should come up with a law that after a certain age, every 5 or 10 years, everyone should be forced to go to a retreat up a mountain and spend 5 days with themselves with no form of communication, nothing digital, nothing analog, no books, magazines, newspapers, iPods, radio, television, and furthermore, conversation should be strictly regulated. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that this might change the world in any major way, but I do think it would change individuals' perspectives about what's important and what's not. Thank you very much.